You're listening to an IOE podcast.
Powered by UCL Minds.
This is Research for the Real World. Conversations with researchers about the paths they've taken to shape our everyday lives.
This is Research for the Real World. Hello, I'm Dr. Laura Uthwaite and I'm a Senior Research Fellow at the UCL Centre for Education Policy and Equalising Opportunities, also known as CPO at IOE, UCL's Faculty of Education and Society. In this season of Research for the Real World, we're going to be focusing on how research at IOE is addressing important current issues related to teacher education, teachers and teaching. So on this episode, I'm absolutely delighted to be talking to Professor Mary Richardson. Mary is a Professor of Educational Assessment and has over 25 years of experience working in higher education, the public sector, and with non-governmental organisations and charities. She currently leads the Masters in Educational Assessment at IOE and has previously worked for the exam board AQA, conducting national studies related to school-based examinations. Her research focuses on how philosophy of education and philosophical discourses can help us to improve assessment practice in all of its forms. For example, she is currently researching how assessment is discussed in public settings, especially online, and how these discourses are eroding trust in education and confidence in assessment. She also has a brand new book out called Rebuilding Public Confidence in Educational Assessment. So Mary, welcome to the podcast.
Hi Laura, thank you very much for having me. It's great to be here.
Excellent. So let's get us started. So how did you become involved in education?
It's actually a long story, but I think it's one worth telling because I always tell it to my students. I didn't do well at school. In fact, I did spectacularly badly at school, and I am of an age that I left school when I was 16 and I managed to get 2 qualifications, my English and Maths, which were called O-levels at the time. That was all I had when I left school. And I went into manual work for quite some time, for many years. It was only later in my 20s and further that I carried on reading and thinking a lot about things. And I was interested in why it hadn't worked for me. And I knew that I wasn't stupid or anything else that people often said at that time about people in schools. And that had happened to me. So I started reading a lot more and thinking more about what education was. And that led me back to university. And I went into university as a mature student. And when I finished the degree that I studied in education, suddenly this whole kind of world of research and ideas opened up to me. And I did some freelance research work within different charities. And that's then led me to just purely by chance working with someone at an exam board, and we got on really well. And a few months later, a job happened to come up, and that was at AQA. And I went into their research team. And again, that just suddenly opened up this whole world of, I wasn't so much interested in what the actual research was, rather than just doing research in education. Because by then I had this real appetite to learn just about stuff, engage with things and try and understand more and more about what this thing called education is. But actually, assessment really grabbed me. It's like, what is this? This is a whole other area of education that really shapes and drives what we do in school and what we do to students and what we do to teachers and everybody. And so the journey is, there are all these things are linked. Then at AQA, I happened to be sat in a national award for a GCSE examination because that was one of my jobs at the time. I had to help work out statistical predictions for national exams and help award grades. So I had a very quantitative role there. And I was confused about what a GCSE in citizenship was. What's this thing? How do you give someone a grade A in citizenship? And what does that mean? And that led to my doctorate. Basically, I was lucky enough to win a national award and did a PhD. And I looked at how do you assess a subject like citizenship? What does that mean? And I was really interested in testing it and what exams look like. And I suppose you could say from there then, that's what kept me then in academia. I got a chance to do some teaching while I was doing my PhD. I absolutely loved it. And then I've just kind of stayed in academia after that. And I've worked with undergraduates. And then 7 years ago, I came to the IOE and took on master's teaching, which I also love. It's a whole different thing, but teaching master's students, supervising doctoral students. But I kept that, holding on to that love of assessment. For me, I think it's the most important area of education. It's the one that gets talked about the most. It's very divisive. It's very controversial in many ways, but it's also really, really badly understood. And that's my one-woman mission as a professor of educational assessment, is to try and help people understand more what this thing is and why it's so important, but why quite often we focus on the aspects of it that are the least important for us in terms of education. And that's sort of where I am now. So during lockdown, I was able to spend lots of time writing this book, as well as teaching and managing all the other things that we did in the university.
Excellent. It really does sound like a one-woman mission. So you really emphasised that assessment is such a huge part of education and, you know, young people's experiences. Can you tell us a little bit more about why it matters? Why is assessment important in education?
Well, there's a couple of things here. So first of all, we have to decide what we mean by assessment. And so I'm going to really lay my cards out here clearly for the listeners. When I use the word assessment, and I say this very clearly in my new book, when I talk about assessment, I mean it to be an umbrella term for all the different types of ways that we are trying to capture and understand learning in any situation. It doesn't matter whether you're taking a driving test, you're taking part in a dance examination, or you're writing a physics paper for your A-levels. All of those are types of assessment. Now, if we want to understand learning and learners, and we want to keep evolving the high standards and amazing understanding we have of education everywhere in the world, we have to keep assessing people. So we have to see what's happened to someone. How has that changed? What's changed about them? What evidence do we have for that change? Has it improved what they know? Has it improved their understanding, their critical engagement, etc.? To me, that's assessment, and we can do that in lots of ways. But I think the problem we have at the moment is when you mention the word assessment, what most people think of are high stakes examinations, like in this country, GCSEs and A-levels. So those, when I use that term high stakes, what I mean by that are tests that are sat by students. Generally, you all file into an exam hall and you sit down for a couple of hours and you regurgitate information onto a piece of paper. Sometimes you might do it on a screen, and then you leave, and then you come back the next day and you do it all again. And you do that over quite a compressed period of time. And then all that data from your scripts goes off to external markers, where it's marked by experts, it's moderated, and then it goes into a system where grades are awarded at the end of it. Now there's nothing wrong with that. That's exams and that's testing, and it's a form of assessment. But it isn't the only form of assessment. And I think the biggest problem we face now is that for some reason, over the years, we've just built up this message again and again. And we've been doing this for over 100 years in this country, longer in other countries. But this is what we think demonstrates how well educated someone is. And assessment equals test results equals, are you good at this or not? And I don't think that's good enough. I don't think that's good enough for children and for students or for teachers either. I don't think it's good enough evidence of what learners are capable of and what teaching and learning is in schools in particular. So this is why I'm constantly kind of snapping away at it like a little terrier, trying to get people to discuss it more and think more about what they mean when they use these words.
So where do you think this crisis of confidence in assessment has come from? Like where do you think it's come about?
It's got worse in the last, I would say, 30 years, really, since the late 1980s, early 1990s. When I was at school, we didn't have a national curriculum. Now, people today find this utterly astonishing. So there's no national curriculum. And I think I took a handful of externally set and assessed exams in my entire education from the age of 4 till 16. Nowadays, students take somewhere in the region of about 150 nationally set and recorded examinations between the ages of 4 and 16 in this country. And all that data is being held on them over time. Now, that data is used in lots of ways. It's used, so the SATs data from the tests that are taken in primary schools for children, for example. That data is used to help potentially predict future competency in subjects, and even some people link it to GCSE outcomes and student potential in that way. So what we've slowly been doing over the years is we've been building more and more externally set and managed testing into our education system. And the emphasis is placed on those results all the time. And schools are judged and then put into league tables and sorted based on lots of these results. And consequently, the schools then also put pressure on the teachers and say, we need better results than this. And then the teachers obviously are putting pressure on the pupils. And we call this, in simple terms, we call this, forms of accountability. So you're constantly making different groups within the education system accountable for their behaviour or their outcome or their ability. And this is one of the issues that's caused the crisis, because this constant thing of setting up, discrete ways of measuring and judging education based on just grades and marks is really problematic, because human beings aren't like that. Who knew? As I said at the beginning, I'm not a hero. I knew I wasn't particularly stupid at school, but I didn't go to a great school. There were no aspirations. No one at our school, very few people went to university. So it's not surprising at the end of my time at school that I did what I did. I'm fortunate that other people encouraged ways out. Now, that kind of system is getting harder and harder to negotiate now for children. And children get stuck. And I think this is the other part of the crisis, is a lot of children get labelled and stuck and told that this is your capability. And if you keep testing and retesting in the way that we do, quite often it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And exams are brilliant for testing certain things. And they do it really well. And they can do it really fairly. But they aren't the best way of doing it. And that's the other problem. We have to change that belief system. We've just got to break this cycle. Politicians don't help. When people like Boris Johnson or Gavin Williamson, who is the former Secretary of State for Education, say things like exams are the fairest way to test people, it's nonsense, absolute rubbish. It's not the fairest way. It's a fair way in certain circumstances. But, I would happily, I'm doing it here in public, argue with them about that. Because seeing things as starkly as that is really unhelpful in terms of education.
So, the way you've talked about it really, it's coming across as such a vicious cycle of, you try and tweak one bit and the knock-on effects. So how do you think we could improve confidence in this area of education?
Okay, there's two things that could help with it. One is we need an actual change to what we do. So we need to remove the reliance on what we call linear examinations, i.e. students study for a couple of years, take a bunch of exams, and that gives you that tells you apparently as a student how good you are at that thing and, moves you on. And to all intents and purposes, those are reasonable measures, yeah? They're okay for the next step. or for using to, say, go to university or to choose your A-levels or whatever it might be. But they're not that good for all students. And the one thing that COVID cracked open to us is that reliance on that system is utterly disastrous when you come to something like a pandemic. Because if we had had a system where a more significant amount of students' continuous assessments, coursework that they've taken over several years, where you can look at a student's progress over time, if we'd had more of that kind of evidence, that would really have helped with giving students grades for GCSEs, awarding GCSEs and A-levels much more accurately. It would help us to be able to, put those data sets together. I say us, I'm talking about the exam boards here. That was their job, and the government to decide what that was. But I think this notion of what we're doing, actually, what's happened now since 2013 and the policy changes to going back to this long period of study and a bunch of exams at the end, it's a very retrograde step. If we went back to the early 1920s, even to about 1890 in this country, you wouldn't see much difference in terms of how we manage testing. And then, say to people, you group are ready to do that group's ready to do that group's ready to do that, and dividing children up in that way and labelling them. We really are, our system is incredibly old-fashioned. We're really working in the Victorian era for our assessment. So, we know loads about assessments, a huge area of research. When I first joined it 25 years ago, it was fairly, it was on a roll. It was opening up. Now, everywhere you go in the world, most education departments and systems have assessment researchers and teams, because it's such an important area of research now, and we realise how important it is. So we need to use that research and be a bit brave about how we change what's actually happening in schools, universities, etc. The second thing we need to do, and that's what my book focuses on, is we need to educate people about assessment more generally. We need to help people understand what it is, what it does, and what it can do. There's a really great quote that I use with all my students, and it comes from the work of a researcher in assessment who's called Paul Newton. He's a contemporary of mine. And he always says, there is no perfect test, there is no perfect assessment. And if you just read the news media and the way people talk about exam results in the summer, you would imagine that there was some magical holy grail somewhere that talks about a perfect outcome. The one piece of truth I'll tell everyone today, and it's the only thing I would literally lay my life on the line on, is it doesn't exist. There's no perfect assessments. Even the best, beautifully designed tests of mathematics, which maths has the highest what we call reliability and validity indices when we're actually exploring the design of certain tests, still has errors in it. There are statistical errors, there are judgmental errors that come into it. So this idea that somehow we can reach perfection is nonsense. Rather, what I think I would like to do, or I would really like to do more of, is actually explain to people and get people to engage with the complexity of what learning and education is, and then how we characterise that with assessment. So how we help people to understand what they've learned and what more they can learn, and how they can engage with learning and education and keep engaging with it. Because one thing that struck me in the last couple of years writing this book as well has been that when everyone's finished their exams, it's kind of almost like leaping off a cliff. We're continuously saying to students, that's the end of education, that's the end of school, you're done. And I just think, reflecting on my own experience, wouldn't it be great if everyone felt like, oh, wow, we're just opening the new door here. There's loads more I can learn. Even if I don't go to university, I could do other stuff, and I can keep learning, I can keep reading, I can keep thinking about stuff. And I think exams have a sort of role that kind of acts as this kind of quite severe ending to something, to say, thank goodness that's behind you. And I think that's a shame too. I think this is all about how we characterise our understanding of education and what the aim of education is. It comes back to one of your previous podcasts, actually, with the wonderful Professor John White, talking about the whole aim of education. This is all very linked. And I have to say, John has been amazingly helpful with me in the last few years, helping me talk through ideas about what all this stuff means to us.
No, definitely. It sounds super interesting. And I really liked your point where you were saying there is no perfect assessment, and so it's, like you say, how do we capture that and have a positive benefit on children's lives rather than it being, what you were calling about the forms of accountability and sort of perpetuating this vicious cycle. So just to keep this theme of change and, the future and what that might look like, just keeping that theme going, could you touch on maybe what changes you think we should make to keep assessment evolving in, should we say, the right direction?
Well, I think, I'm not sure what the right direction might be, but I think I want to, obviously I'm really glad that it constantly comes in and out of public spaces because it's a public endeavour, that it's not just something that happens in schools, it impacts all our lives, parents, you're watching the children, listening to what they're doing, etc. in schools, families, get involved with it. It impacts employers, it impacts schools, universities, everywhere you go. So I think having these conversations is really important, but looking at ways we can help people to understand it better and informing people. So one thing I think is very important is that we invest more in actual education of professionals involved in education, teachers, leaders in schools, etc., so that people are kept up to date and they are constantly learning about updates and changes in assessment, theory and practice that's based on evidence. So I'm not just talking about policy changes here, I'm actually talking about evidence-based practice in the classroom. So actually providing more opportunities for teachers to be able to engage in that, but also being able to find ways that we can actually open up better public understanding. So putting it out there in the public arena, better explanations and discussions of what assessment is, about what it matters, how it impacts our lives in all sorts of ways. And that could be done through, news, using online settings, using technologies as a way to, we're very good at using tech to spread all sorts of messages. And I think there are aspects of that messaging that we could harness in education. And one of the messages is about, good understanding of what assessment is and what its capabilities are going forward.
Excellent. So you've mentioned a few times throughout the podcast that you do have a new book coming out called Rebuilding Public Confidence in Education Assessment. Are you able to talk a little bit more about it and where it all fits into the current discourse around exams and exam results?
Yeah, of course. Happy to. So basically, it came about from another anecdote, which actually makes the first chapter of the book. In short, it came about from me reading an actual letter to Santa Claus while I was doing some research in Finland. Now, the research was nothing to do with Santa, but I happened to go to his grotto to send some Christmas cards to family members. And in there, I found files of letters from children from all over the world. And someone showed me the one from England. And I found an actual letter written by a teenager asking for better exam grades in her GCSEs. Now, I discuss the issues I have just generally with that in the book. But it stayed with me. It's always stayed with me, this, right? So I took a photograph of it. I was so shocked at the sheer level of stress and anxiety that you must feel to do that. And it also just shocked me kind of to the core, thinking, how have we got here? What's happened that someone's doing this? And trying to understand what that would even be like, because I've never had that feeling and that fear of failure in that sense relating to exams. Okay, so this is where the book starts, really, is thinking about why have we got to a point where education or success in education is linked to a set of results that then label someone and make them feel, give us emotional responses in this way that can be really profound, that can label us and make us feel like failures more often than we might feel successes. And what failure looks like. This is something else that shocks me, and this is another example in the book, is the fact now that I'm finding more and more evidence from the work and research I've done at looking at how people talk online about assessment in particular, in social forums and other things, that now I find it extraordinary that students are saying things that if they don't get a grade 9 or an A star or a first, that all they're learning is worth nothing, that they're a failure too. And this idea that we are always striving to be at the top all the time. Now, I've come up with a new theoretical concept in this, and I call this assessment dysmorphia. And it's a theme or a theory that I've stolen from body image research. There's a wonderful book by a psychologist called Lizzie Orbach, and it's called Bodies. And in it, she poses this idea that people who have issues with how they look, it's called body dysmorphia, where when you actually look in the mirror, you can't see the reality, and you have a compulsion and obsessive attitude to how you look, the shape of your body, what you're putting in your body, etc. I think we've developed this in assessment, an obsession, a dysmorphic obsession with high stakes testing as a form of assessment, that it's the way to show how good we are at something or not, that you must get the highest results or you're not good enough, it won't get you anywhere, etc. And this idea that you are always having to achieve at the top. And I find this very, very astonishing and disturbing, because what's really interesting is there are other discourses coming around at the moment, particularly in similar areas such as podcasting, social media, forums, etc., where people are talking about failure too, about when things go wrong and what we learn from failure. Okay, I'm not advocating that everyone should fail. That would be nonsense. But what I am advocating is that we need to understand what our capability might be in some areas, and it might not be as good as someone else's. And that's okay. There are loads of things that I just, I know I will never be able to grasp, much as I'd love to, and I've tried really hard at them, but I just can't do it. So fair enough. There's other things that I'm good at. That's fair enough too. And actually helping people to understand that, and to understand that in relation to the subjects they study, is very, very important. And understanding what education means to us and being educated means, that's absolutely vital. Understanding that failure in an exam doesn't mean you can't enjoy doing X or Y or learning about X or Y. And that's at the heart of the book. That's what this is about this idea about changing how we see it. And I argue at the end that we need to start creating new discourses of esteem, I call them, actually helping build up cultures and ways of thinking that improve and really add richness and value to the whole idea of learning and what learning can do for us and what education can do for us beyond a set of exam results.
That's so interesting, Mary. And the whole way you were just talking then, it was really resonating with my own experience as a master's student, because my master's was part of my PhD funding. And so getting the best grades wasn't contingent on whether I progressed. I just needed to pass. And so it took away that pressure of I don't need to focus on my assessments and doing the best. It was about pursuing the topics that were slightly harder or going for the topics that were more interesting, whether I was good at them or not. And it just opened my world in a way that I may not have experienced had it been all about getting, a distinction or a first. I still did get a distinction, but that wasn't the main focal point. And yeah, I just learned so much through that year that maybe I wouldn't have if it had all just been about assessment. So yeah, the book sounds super, super interesting. I hope it goes well with the launch. So you've As you mentioned, you spent a lot of COVID working on the book, and you've got this very clear passion for education and assessment. But what's next? What's your next big project?
Well, I'm already working on some other projects. I'm actually just starting a survey to go out this week to look at the preparedness of the Year 13 students in England. Those are the students who are taking their A-levels this year, all things being equal. I'm really interested not in the subjects they've studied or how they've worked. I'm interested in how prepared they feel. And I want to try and capture a snapshot of data of those students this year, because they are a unique cohort, because they didn't take their GCSEs, they didn't do exams last year, and this will be the first year, and there'll be no other cohort like them. And so I'm trying to just capture that notion of preparedness only from their perspective at the moment. And then the other project I'm doing is a funded piece of research, which goes on. I started it at the end of last year. It goes on to the end of this year. And we're looking at international language tests for academic purposes with Pearson International, who are funding this. And I'm looking at user interactions and understanding of artificial intelligence, because these tests use AI technology throughout the test setting and for the marking of the papers. And so what I'm interested in, again, less interested in the content and marking, more interested in user perceptions of interacting with AI technology. Do they understand it? Do they know it's happening to them? What do they think about it? And what does it mean? Because, a lot of people see AI as the future of testing. It's not, it's here. We've been doing it for a long time. AI is used an awful lot in sorts of assessment. So that's my next sort of real interest.
Great. Thanks so much, Mary. It's been really interesting to hear all about your research, your career, and like I say, your passion for this topic. So thank you so much.
Oh, thanks very much, Laura. It's absolutely lovely to meet you, and thank you very much for asking me. And I'm always happy to talk about assessment.
Great stuff. So you can follow Mary on Twitter at MIRichEd to learn more about her research. Some of what we've covered today is also available in the episode notes. If you've enjoyed this episode, we have an archive of 15 past seasons. Just search IOE Podcast from wherever you get your podcasts from to find episodes of Research for the Real World, as well as more podcasts from IOE. And just a quick favour before I go, if you are listening to us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, we'd really appreciate it if you could please give the IOE podcast a rating. 5 stars would be nice. This will really help us to spread our reach about all of our important work here at the IOE. I'm Dr. Laura Uthwaite, and thank you for listening.
Research for the Real World is produced by IOE Marketing and Communications and IOE Research Development. The theme music was created by Rob Cochran. Tatiana Sotero Diaz is the series advisor, Amy Leibowitz is the series producer, and Jason Ilagan is the executive producer of the IOE podcast.
Thanks so much for downloading and listening to this IOE podcast.